Long before the thunder of cannon fire and the clash of nations that would one day bear his name, Napoleon Bonaparte was simply a child of an island, a quiet, rocky place in the blue heart of the Mediterranean called Corsica. The island was wild and rugged, its hills clothed with olive trees and low brush, its coastlines touched by warm, glittering seas. Life there was both harsh and simple, shaped by the rhythms of the earth, the weather, and the stubborn pride of its people. Napoleon was born in the town of Ajaccio in the summer of 1769, only a few months after Corsica had been taken by France. His family, the Bonapartes, were of Italian descent, minor nobles with a proud name but little wealth. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer and a man of energy, loyal to Corsican independence before he accepted French rule as a practical necessity. His mother, Letizia, was strong-willed and firm, guiding her many children with quiet authority. Napoleon was the second of 8 surviving siblings, and from his earliest years, he was accustomed to both noise and competition. The world of his childhood was small, yet full of contrast. The streets of Ajaccio were narrow and sunlit, filled with the scents of salt and wood smoke. The family home, though modest, echoed with ambition. His mother ruled it with discipline and devotion, teaching her children the value of thrift and endurance. Napoleon often looked up to her as the steady heart of the family, and in later years he would say that all his strength came from her. From his father he learned something different, the charm of opportunity, the art of seeing possibilities even in hardship. Carlo traveled often to mainland France, serving as Corsica's representative, mingling with officials and men of influence. He wanted better things for his children, and he saw in Napoleon a sharp mind, restless and intense, capable of far more than island life might offer. Corsica itself, though small, left a mark on Napoleon's spirit. Its mountains and storms, its independence and pride, shaped his sense of self. He admired its defiance, its tradition of resisting foreign control, and though he would later serve France with all his might, a part of Himmelways belonged to that island, the stubbornness, the solitude, the unbending will of its people. When Napoleon was 9 years old, his father secured him a place in a school on the French mainland. It was the beginning of a journey that would carry him far from home and deeper into a world of opportunity and challenge. In 1779, he left Corsica with his older brother, Joseph, sailing north toward France. The voyage was long, and the boy watched the island's outline fade into the horizon, his first departure, and perhaps his first sense of destiny. The school at Autumn, where he began, was meant to prepare him in language and manners before he entered the military academy at Brienne. But for a boy from Corsica, whose French was marked by a thick accent and whose pride was quick to rise, it was not an easy beginning. His classmates laughed at his strange speech, his dark complexion, his fierce temper. Napoleon learned dearly to stand apart, to defend himself with words and with silence. He read constantly, studied deeply, and found in books a world that answered his hunger for meaning. At Brienne, the military academy he entered at age 10, life was strict and structured. The air was colder, the discipline sharper. Students rose early, marched, studied mathematics, geography, and strategy. The young Napoleon, small and thin, was not among the most popular boys. He was quiet, solitary, often wandering the school grounds alone. Yet his teachers noticed his mind, sharp, methodical, curious. He excelled at mathematics, the language of artillery and precision, and he took special interest in the stories of great leaders, Alexander the Great, Hannibal, and Caesar. He admired not only their victories, but their determination, the way they turned obstacles into triumphs. In the evenings, while others played or slept, Napoleon read by lamplight, his thoughts already turning toward the possibilities of power, of achievement, of a life that reached far beyond the narrow corridors of the academy. At Brienne, he also learned another lesson, the power of endurance. Surrounded by wealthier students mocked for his Corsican roots, he built a shell of discipline around himself. He spoke little, worked constantly, and waited. That quiet patience, that ability to bide his time, would become one of the defining traits of his life. When he was 15, Napoleon completed his studies at Brienne and earned a place at the Royal Military School of Paris, one of the most prestigious academies in France. There he finished his training, focusing on artillery, the branch of the army most suited to his love of mathematics and strategy. At 16, he graduated as a second lieutenant, ready to serve the French army. He was young, serious, and ambitious, with little money, but a growing sense of purpose. Yet beneath his calm demeanor, the world around him was beginning to change. The France he entered as a young officer was still ruled by kings and nobles, but unrest was stirring. Taxes were heavy, the poor grew restless, and the old order was beginning to tremble. Napoleon watched it all with careful eyes. He was a man shaped by both opportunity and observation, learning that history could turn quickly when the moment was right. Still, in those early years, he remained the outsider, the Corsican in French uniform standing slightly apart, disciplined yet distant. He wrote letters to his family, worried over debts, and dreamed of home. He read philosophy, studied the thinkers of the Enlightenment, and began to form ideas of leadership, of power, of the delicate balance between force and vision. In the quiet of barracks and small garrisons, he built himself piece by piece an identity that blended the solitude of his island youth with the precision of military life. Others might have seen a young officer of little consequence, but within him the fire of ambition burned steadily, hidden beneath discipline, waiting for the moment when the world would open and his talents would meet opportunity. Corsica had given him pride. France would give him purpose, and together they would forge the path that would one day lead him from the narrow streets of Ajaccio, the grand halls of Europe. But for now, he was still only a soldier, thoughtful, observant, and quietly determined, a man whose destiny was just beginning to unfold. And so, as the chapter of his childhood closed, the boy from the island stepped into the wider world. The storms of history were gathering, the revolution approaching, and somewhere deep within the calm young officer, the idea of greatness began to take root. The child of Corsica was becoming a man of France, and though he could not yet see the shape of the future, the world was already beginning to turn toward him. By the time Napoleon Bonaparte earned his officer's commission, the world he had known as a student was beginning to crumble. France, still ruled by a king, was restless. The poor grew hungrier, the nobles more fearful, and the whispers of change began to fill the air like the rising wind before a storm. For centuries, France had been a kingdom of privilege, where power was born into anime. But in the late 1780s, the old balance was failing. A new age was stirring, one that would sweep away the world Napoleon had entered and create the one in which he would rise. At first, he stood apart from it all. The young lieutenant stationed far from Paris lived quietly, studying his craft and writing long, thoughtful letters home. He was 20 years old, serious, solitary, and already given to deep reflection. The revolution, when it came, reached him not through speeches or rallies, but through the slow, echoing news that travelled across the provinces. The king had called the Estates General, the people were demanding rights, the Bastille had fallen. In 1789, the old order began to collapse. The idea of monarchy by divine right gave way to the voice of the nation. For some, the change brought fear, for others, hope. To Napoleon, it was an opportunity, not one of ambition, not yet, but of meaning. He believed in merit, in the idea that talent should matter more than birth, and the revolution, with all its chaos, made such things possible. He returned briefly to Corsica that year, drawn by the same tension that was now reshaping France. His homeland, too, was divided between those who wanted independence and those who accepted French rule. Napoleon, torn between his love for Corsica and his loyalty to France, found himself caught in between. The island's struggles grew bitter, families split by politics, and Napoleon's own path began to tilt toward the mainland once again. His dreams were larger than Corsica could hold, and France, though turbulent, offered a stage wide enough for his restless energy. By 1792, the revolution had entered its most volatile years. The monarchy was gone, replaced by the new republic, but the nation was surrounded by enemies, monarchs of Europe who feared that France's revolution might spread to their own lands. The young republic called for soldiers, and the army swelled with men from every walk of life. Among them was Napoleon, now a captain, eager to serve, eager to prove himself not by words, but by action. He was assigned to the artillery, the branch of warfare that combined mathematics, science, and precision. It was an art that suited him perfectly. He studied maps, others studied scripture, calculating angles, distances, and possibilities. He saw the battlefield not as chaos, but as a problem to be solved. To his superiors, he was quiet, efficient, and ambitious. To his subordinates, he was demanding but fair. The revolution had torn down barriers that would once have confined him. Nobles fled, officers resigned or were executed, and new opportunities opened for those who could fill the void. In this shifting world, talent rose faster than pedigree. Napoleon, with his discipline and focus, advanced quickly. He wrote essays on politics, reflections on power, even a small book on the art of war. His thoughts revealed a man who believed that the destiny of nations depended on strong leadership and clear vision, ideas that would one day guide him completely. But for now, he was still a soldier, and France was still learning how to govern itself. In 1793, civil war and foreign invasion threatened to pull the nation apart. In the south, Royalist forces and British troops took control of the port city of Toulon. It was there that Napoleon's skill and determination would first bring him real fame. When he arrived at Toulon, the situation was desperate. Republican forces were scattered, their artillery poorly placed, their morale low. Napoleon, then only 24, studied the defenses, the ships in the harbor, and the hills that surrounded the city. He saw what others had missed, that the key to Toulon was not brute force but geometry and patience. He reorganized the artillery, built new batteries in silence, and slowly began to tighten thering around the city. The siege lasted months, marked by exhaustion and uncertainty, but under Napoleon's direction, the artillery grew more precise, the bombardments more effective. At last, the British fleet withdrew, and Toulon fell back into Republican hands. The victory was decisive, and it bore Napoleon's signature. His courage had been noticed, his name spoken with admiration. Paris heard of him. His reports, clear and confident, reached the highest levels of government. For the first time, Napoleon Bonaparte was not just an officer, but a man to watch. He was promoted to brigadier general at 24, an astonishing rise in a military still adjusting to the revolution's turbulence. Yet even in triumph, he remained introspective. He saw how quickly fortune turned, how those celebrated one day could fall the next. In the months that followed, the revolution descended into its darkest phase, the reign of terror. Paris was filled with suspicion, and guillotines stood in the squares as symbols of virtue turned violent. Napoleon, cautious and observant, avoided the worst of it. He served quietly, writing and studying as others schemed. His ambitions were growing, but so too was his patience. He began to believe that destiny favored those who could see order in chaos, those who moved not rashly, but with understanding. And so, even as France convulsed, he waited. The storms of revolution, he knew, created not only ruin, but opportunity. The boy from Corsica had now become a general of France, but his journey was only beginning. He had tasted command and recognition, but greater trials lay ahead. Trials that would test not just his skill, but his endurance, his judgment, and his sense of self. For now, though, he was still a soldier of the revolution, a quiet figure among many, moving carefully through a world remade by ideas and ambition. The revolution had torn down the walls that once confined him, but it had also unleashed forces that no one could control. In that uncertain world, Napoleon found his purpose. The army gave him structure, and the revolution gave him meaning. And as France stumbled toward its next chapter, he stood ready, watchful, composed, and waiting for the moment when history once again would need a man of action. The year was 1793, and the young Republic of France stood, trembling on uncertain ground. The revolution, which had begun with dreams of liberty and equality, had hardened into suspicion and fear. Enemies pressed from all sides, monarchs abroad, rebels at home, and discontent festering within the very heart of the nation. The streets of Paris echoed with the voices of radicals, the clang of the guillotine, and the weary silence of those who'd seen too much. Far to the south, along the blue curve of the Mediterranean coast, lay the city of Toulon. Its harbor was wide and deep, home to the French fleet. But now, that fleet flew the flags of rebellion. Royalist sympathizers had taken the city, inviting British and Spanish forces to occupy its ports in defiance of the Republic. If Toulon remained in enemy hands, France would lose not only its ships, but its gateway to the sea. It was a crisis that demanded both speed and precision, and into this storm stepped a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte. He was 24 years old, recently promoted, and still a stranger to most of those around him. Yet his quiet confidence, the sharpness of his gaze, and his methodical manner set him apart. When he arrived, the Republican army besieging Toulon was disorganized, poorly supplied, and unsure how to proceed. Its generals argued among themselves, its troops were weary, and its cannons were scattered without plan. Napoleon surveyed the situation with a soldier's calm. He spent days studying the terrain, walking the hills that overlooked the city, tracing lines in the dirt with the tip of his sword. He noticed what others had missed. The Toulon's defences were strong from the front, but vulnerable from the high ground behind it. If he could seize those heights and position his artillery there, the enemy's ships would be forced to withdraw. The plan was simple, logical, and daring. He began quietly, reorganizing the artillery with relentless precision. Guns were moved by night, supplies gathered, trenches dug in silence. He worked tirelessly, his uniform often covered in dust, his voice steady but firm. The soldiers, at first skeptical of the young Corsican officer, soon found themselves drawn to his energy. He spoke little of glory, but much of discipline, of the satisfaction of order and achievement. Under his direction, the scattered batteries began to act as one, their fire coordinated, their purpose clear. The siege dragged on for months. Winter came to the southern coast, bringing cold winds from the sea, and long nights filled with the distant boom of cannon fire. Within the city, the royalists and their foreign allies held fast. But outside the walls, Napoleon's guns grew louder, more precise, more confident. Each day brought progress measured in yards, in volleys, in the slow tightening of the noose. Among his comrades, he remained a quiet figure, intense, deliberate, and focused. He rarely slept more than a few hours, preferring to walk the batteries, to adjust angles himself, to speak softly to the men as they worked. He carried himself not with arrogance, but with an almost serene determination. Those who watched him sensed that he saw the battlefield differently, as though he were moving pieces on a vast board only he could fully see. In December, the time came to act. The high ground known as Fort l'Aiguillette, the key to the harbour, was taken after a fierce assault. Napoleon's artillery was moved there, and from that height his guns commanded the sea. The bombardment began, steady and unrelenting. British and Spanish ships, trapped under the rain of fire, began to pull away, smoke and flame rising from the water. The enemy could no longer hold the port. Within days, Toulon fell back into Republican hands. It was a victory that echoed far beyond the Mediterranean. The loss of Toulon had threatened the very existence of the Republic's navy. Its recovery restored hope. In Paris, officials read the reports with interest. One name appeared again and again: Captain Bonaparte, the young artillery officer whose precision and foresight had turned the tide. His promotion to brigadier general soon followed. For Napoleon, Toulon was more than a triumph of arms. It was a test of will and a glimpse of what leadership could mean. He had learned that men followed not only courage but clarity, that order, discipline, and purpose could transform despair into victory. He had seen how a plan calmly executed could change the course of events. It was a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. And yet, even in success, he remained reflective. In letters to his family, he spoke little of glory. Instead, he wrote of the cost of war, of the exhaustion of soldiers, of the thin line between triumph and ruin. One must act, he wrote once, but one must think as well. To him, the art of war was not chaos, but reason applied to danger, a quiet mind guiding the fury of men and machines. The victory at Toulon marked the beginning of his rise, but Napoleon's world was still one of uncertainty. The revolution continued to burn, shifting from one faction to another, consuming heroes as quickly as it created them. In Paris, power was measured by fear, and the guillotine was never far from politics. Yet amid the turmoil, Napoleon's name began to circulate among the leaders of the Republic. He was spoken of as a man of promise, young, capable, and untainted by the worst excesses of the revolution. In the years to come, he would face moments of exile and triumph, of loyalty and betrayal, of command and solitude. But Toulon remained the first clear step, the moment when his skill met circumstance and the world began to take notice. And so, as the smoke cleared from the harbour and the last ships vanished over the horizon, a new name entered the history of France. The boy from Corsica, the quiet student of artillery, had proven that thought and courage, joined together, could reshape history. He had turned geometry into victory, calculation into destiny. The guns of Toulon fell silent, but their echoes would follow him for the rest of his life. By the year 1796, France had changed beyond recognition. The monarchy was gone, the guillotine's shadow had begun to fade, and the Directory, a fragile government of 5 men, now struggled to hold the country together. Years of revolution and war had left the nation exhausted. The armies of France were poorly paid, poorly supplied, and often poorly led. Yet their spirit remained unbroken, and their victories still shaped the destiny of Europe. Among the many fronts where France fought, the Italian campaign seemed the least promising. The soldiers there were tired and hungry, their uniforms threadbare, their confidence worn thin. Their commanders bickered and stalled, their strategies cautious and uninspired. It was to this army, scattered along the rough passes of the Alps, that the Directory sent a new commander, a thin, sharp-eyed young man of 26, recently married, with a reputation for intelligence and daring. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. When he first arrived to take command of the army of Italy, many of his officers looked at him with doubt. He was young, far younger than most generals, and his frame seemed delicate compared to the hardened soldiers who surrounded him. His uniform, though neat, carried little sign of grandeur, but when he spoke, the doubts began to soften. His voice, though calm, carried clarity and conviction. He spoke not of fear or politics, but of purpose. "Soldiers," he told them, "you are hungry and naked, and the government owes you much but can give you nothing. Your patience, your courage do you honor, but bring you no glory. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces and great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and wealth." The words were simple, yet they awakened something in the hearts of men who had known only hardship, had promised them not miracles but meaning, that their suffering would lead somewhere, that their courage had purpose. And so, with little more than determination and imagination, Napoleon began his first great campaign. The war in Italy was complex. France's enemies, Austria, Sardinia, and their allies, controlled much of northern Italy, their armies entrenched across mountains and rivers. The French, outnumbered and undersupplied, could not win by brute force. But Napoleon saw the field differently. Where others saw obstacles, he saw opportunity. His-mind, trained in geometry and movement, envisioned battle as a living map. He moved quickly, striking where his enemies least expected, dividing their forces and defeating them one by one. His armies marched light, carrying few supplies, moving with speed that bewildered their foes. He crossed rivers that others thought impassable, climbed mountains that seemed unscalable, and appeared where no one imagined he could. At Montenotte, at Lodi, at Arcole, his victories came one after another, swift, decisive, almost improbable. At Lodi especially, his courage became legend. The Austrians had taken position across a bridge spanning the Adda River, their cannons lined and ready. For a moment, even the bravest hesitated. The bridge was narrow, the air thick with smoke, and death waited on the far side. Napoleon, seeing his men falter, stepped forward himself. He seized a flag, called out for courage, and led the charge. The air was filled with musket fire, the roar of artillery, the shouts of men. When the smoke cleared, the French had taken the bridge, and the enemy was in retreat. In later years, Napoleon would remember that moment as the birth of his destiny, the instant he felt the thread of greatness pull taut within him. His soldiers began to see him not only as their commander, but as their star, the man who shared their hardships and never asked of them what he would not do himself. After each victory, he treated his men with care. He arranged for their food and rest, spoke with them by name, praised them in dispatches. To the leaders of conquered cities, he was firm but often merciful, promising peace to those who cooperated, protection for art and learning, and punishment only for resistance. Even in war, his curiosity never slept. He visited libraries, admired architecture, and studied the cultures of the lands he entered. He carried within him the discipline of a soldier and the mind of a scholar, a rare combination that made his command both brilliant and unpredictable. By the end of the campaign, the French army had achieved what few believed possible. They had defeated larger, better supplied forces, captured Milan, and forced Austria into negotiation. In little more than a year, the young general from Corsica had transformed an army of weary men into a force that carried the Republic's hopes. He was hailed in Paris as a hero, his name printed in newspapers, his victories celebrated in every corner of France. Yet while others saw only glory, Napoleon saw a deeper lesson. He had learned that war was not only a contest of strength, but of mind, that speed, surprise, and clarity could accomplish what numbers could not. He had seen how morale, once awakened, could carry men beyond fear. He had felt too the intoxicating pull of command, the way decisions shaped lives, the way power flowed to those who acted without hesitation. Still, even amid his triumph, Napoleon remained thoughtful. He wrote letters to his wife, Josephine, filled with affection and longing, though distance and politics often strained their bond. He thought about France, its instability, its weariness, its hunger for order. He sensed even then that his victories abroad might one day lead him toward power at home. The Italian campaign ended with peace treaties and parades, but its true legacy lay in transformation of both France and its young general. The boy who had once walked alone at Brienne, mocked for his accent, had now drawn the map of Europe. He was no longer the obscure officer of Toulon, nor the ambitious young man of Paris. He was Napoleon Bonaparte, the conqueror of Italy, the man whose name stirred both admiration and unease. And yet, when asked what gave him such confidence, he once replied with quiet simplicity, "In war, men are nothing, one man is everything." It was not arrogance, but recognition, that history often turns upon the clarity of a single mind, upon the calm within the storm. At Lodi, he had seen it. In Italy, he had proven it. And though he did not yet know where it would lead, he sensed that destiny had already chosen its path, and that his own steps were following it faithfully, on a victory at a time. After the triumphs of Italy, Napoleon Bonaparte returned to France as a hero. His victories had astonished Europe, and the Republic, so long battered by internal division and war, found in him a symbol of revival, a young general whose talent seemed limitless. In Paris, crowds gathered to see him. His portrait hung in windows, his name whispered with both admiration and fear. Yet for Napoleon himself, the glory of success brought a new kind of restlessness. He was 28, and though adored, he felt confined. The Directory, wary of his growing influence, offered him few new commands in Europe. His ambitions, however, could not be contained by hesitation or politics. He dreamed of horizons beyond the familiar, of ancient lands, forgotten empires, and a stage grand enough for both conquest and enlightenment. And so, when the idea rose to strike at British influence not in Europe, but in the East, Napoleon saw his opportunity. The plan was bold, almost fantastical. He would lead an army to Egypt, a land of deserts and pyramids, where the echoes of ancient civilizations still lingered. The expedition would weaken Britain's access to India, expand French influence, and perhaps open a path toward the wider world. But beneath the military ambition, there was also curiosity, a hunger to understand the past, to stand where pharaohs had once ruled and to leave his own mark upon history's oldest soil. In the spring of 1798, he set sail from the port of Toulon with nearly 40,000 men and a vast fleet. Among the soldiers were not only officers and engineers, but scholars, artists, and scientists, men chosen to study Egypt's mysteries, to record its monuments, its flora, its stars. It was a campaign of conquest, but also of discovery. The sea voyage was long, the air filled with salt and uncertainty. As the sails swelled and the coast of France faded behind them, few knew what awaited. The fleet moved quietly across the Mediterranean, avoiding the British Navy, until at last the yellow horizon of Africa appeared. The soldiers, stepping ashore under a burning sun, were struck by the strangeness of the land, the light, the silence, the endless stretches of sand. Napoleon, riding among them, spoke of destiny, of history, of glory. "Soldiers," he said softly, 40 centuries look down upon you. He was speaking of the pyramids that rose in the distance, ancient, immense, silent witnesses to the passage of time. The campaign that followed was both remarkable and cruel. The French defeated the Mamluk forces at the Battle of the Pyramids, their disciplined line standing firm against cavalry charges that seemed to come from another age. The victory was swift, almost dreamlike, and Egypt lay open before them. Yet their triumph was shadowed by disaster. At Aboukir Bay, the British Navy under Admiral Nelson destroyed the French fleet, cutting Napoleon's army off from Europe. The sands of Egypt, once promising glory, had become a trap. Still, Napoleon pressed on. In Cairo, he tried to govern as both conqueror and reformer. He established new laws, reorganized administration, and encouraged study of the land. The scholars who had accompanied him set about their work, measuring temples, copying inscriptions, mapping ruins. Their discoveries would later fill volumes, awakening Europe's fascination with the ancient world. The description de l'Égypte, born from their labor, would become one of the great treasures of knowledge. Yet for the soldiers, the days were long and harsh. The heat was relentless, disease spread, and the promise of riches faded into dust. Napoleon himself grew weary, though he showed no sign of it. At night, he would stand on the balcony of his quarters, looking out over the city, its domes and narrow streets bathed in moonlight. He admired its strangeness, its beauty, its endurance. Here was a civilization older than any empire he could build, a reminder that even the greatest rulers were but moments in time. The longer he remained, the clearer it became that Egypt could not be held. The British dominated the seas, The local resistance simmered, and the French army, though loyal, was dwindling in strength. Napoleon's ambition, which had burned so brightly, began to turn inward, toward thoughts of home, of France, and of the future. He knew the Directory was weak, unpopular, and that the people longed for stability. The opportunity he had sought in the East now seemed to lie once more in Europe. In August of 1799, he made a decision that surprised even those closest to him. Leaving his army behind under trusted command, he boarded a small ship and slipped away across the Mediterranean. The journey was perilous, with British ships prowling the waters, but fortune favored him once again. After weeks at sea, he landed on the coast of France. The country he returned to was restless and weary, its government near collapse. His arrival caused a stir. The hero of Italy, long thought lost in Egypt, had returned as though from myth. Crowd cheered, newspapers celebrated, and politicians whispered. They saw in him not only a soldier, but a solution, a man who might restore order to a nation grown tired of uncertainty. Napoleon, calm and deliberate, said little, but behind his quiet eyes, plans were already forming. Egypt had changed him. It had shown him both the heights and limits of ambition, the grandeur of vision, and the shadow that always followed. He had walked among ruins that had outlasted kings, had seen empires rise and fall beneath the unchanging sun. He understood now that conquest alone was not enough, that to rule truly, one must shape not only land, but destiny. The sands of Egypt had humbled him even as they had elevated him. They had taught him patience, perspective, and perhaps a touch of melancholy. And as the shores of France rose before him once again, Napoleon Bonaparte stepped from the ship not just as a general returning from campaign, but as a man transformed, one who had glimpsed both glory and its cost. The boy from Corsica had become a conqueror. The conqueror had become a visionary, and in the quiet turning of that transformation, the path to empire began to take shape, not in noise or triumph, but in thought, in purpose, and in the steady confidence of a man who had begun to see his own reflection in history itself. When Napoleon stepped ashore in France in the autumn of 1799, the air was cool and still. The long voyage from Egypt had left him pale, but his mind was clear. He had returned quietly, with only a few companions, slipping through the British patrols that watched the Mediterranean. To the world, his reappearance seemed almost miraculous. A figure thought lost to the desert had returned unannounced to a country adrift in confusion. France was weary. 10 years of revolution had shaken its every foundation. Kings had fallen, assemblies had risen and collapsed, and each new government promised peace only to bring more uncertainty. The Directory, the 5-man council that ruled the Republic, had lost the confidence of the people. Inflation had eaten away at savings. Corruption was everywhere, and the wars that had once inspired hope now dragged on without direction. In the streets of Paris, people whispered that the Republic was dying, that only a strong hand could save it. And when Napoleon's ship arrived, many felt, perhaps without knowing why, that this was the hand they had been waiting for. He said little in those first days. He met with officials, old allies, and quietly assess the situation. He saw that France, though exhausted, was ready for change, not another revolution, but stability. He had learned in Egypt the value of patience, and now he applied it. His tone was calm, his words measured. He spoke not of conquest, but of renewal, of the need to bring peace to a nation that had grown tired of turmoil. Those who met him noticed his composure. He was no longer the fiery general of the Italian campaigns, charging across bridges and rallying soldiers with his own hands. He had become something different, more restrained, more deliberate, a man who seemed to carry within him a sense of destiny that did not need to be shouted aloud. As he moved through Paris, the crowds followed him. Shopkeepers stepped from their doorways, soldiers saluted, women waved handkerchiefs from windows. "Here is the man of victory," they said. "Here is the man who can bring order." Even those who did not fully trust him found comfort in his presence. He represented something they had lost: certainty, direction, and quiet control. The politicians of the Directory, however, felt another emotion: fear. They had seen many generals rise before, but none with Napoleon's reputation or intelligence. They knew that he was not simply a soldier. He was a strategist, both in battle and in politics. They hoped to use his popularity to strengthen their own failing power. But Napoleon had already begun to imagine something greater. He began meeting privately with key figures, men like Emmanuel Sieyès, a shrewd politician and one of the architects of the Republic. They spoke of reform, overstructuring the government to bring stability. But in Napoleon's mind, reform meant something else: control, efficiency, unity. The nation needed one leader, not 5. It needed decisiveness, not debate. It needed a figure who could speak for France itself. Through the early days of November, quiet plans took shape. Loyal officers were positioned in the capital, troops were brought closer under the pretext of security, and orders were given discreetly. Few outside the inner circle understood what was about to happen. Napoleon remained calm, visiting his family, walking the gardens of Paris, saying little, waiting for the moment when everything would align. On the morning of November 9th, 1799, or the 18th of Brumaire, according to the revolutionary calendar, the plan unfolded. Troops loyal to Napoleon surrounded the government buildings. Members of the Directory were persuaded, coerced, or simply swept aside. In a single day, without bloodshed, the old order was dissolved. Napoleon entered the chamber of the legislature, his uniform plain, his voice steady. He spoke of chaos, of corruption, of the need for stability. "Citizens," he said, "the revolution is ended." By nightfall, power had shifted completely. The Directory was gone. In its place, a new government was formed, the Consulate, with 3 men at its head. But all who looked at the arrangement could see where true power rested. Napoleon was named First Consul, a title simple in appearance yet immense in meaning. France, exhausted by years of revolution, had found its new leader. There were no grand parades, no proclamations of empire. The change came quietly, as though it had been waiting to happen all along. The people, weary of instability, accepted it with relief. The streets of Paris, once filled with anger and shouting, grew calm. In the days that followed, Napoleon began to govern not as a usurper but as a reformer. He met with economists, lawyers, and engineers. He spoke of rebuilding France's institutions, restoring its finances, and strengthening its army. His days were long, his attention constant. Even those who opposed him found themselves drawn into his vision of order. Yet beneath his calm exterior, ambition stirred. He saw himself as the guardian of the revolution's true ideals: liberty, equality, merit, but shaped through discipline and authority. The years of chaos had shown him that freedom without structure was fragile. Now he would bring structure, and in doing so, he would bind the revolution into something lasting. As winter settled over Paris, the lights of the city glowed in quiet warmth. The France that had once been consumed by fire was breathing again, and at its center stood the First Consul, the boy from Corsica, the soldier of the revolution, the conqueror of Italy and Egypt, now the calm architect of France's rebirth. He had returned from the deserts, not to fight another war but to build something enduring. Yet, like the sands of Egypt that still haunted his memory, he knew how easily even the strongest foundations could shift. For now, though, he moved with quiet certainty. The future lay before him, and France was his to shape. In the quiet dawn of November 9th, 1799, or the 18th of Brumaire as it was called in the revolutionary calendar, Paris woke beneath a pale, misty sky. The air was heavy with the promise of change, though most citizens went about their morning unaware that history itself was turning in the streets around them. Within the city, soldiers moved quietly under orders, gathering at crossroads and bridges. They carried no banners, shouted no slogans. Their faces were calm, their movements practiced. It was not the beginning of a revolution, but the end of one. Napoleon Bonaparte, now the most celebrated soldier in France, had returned from Egypt only months before. He'd found his country exhausted, the Directory corrupt, the economy failing, and the people disillusioned. The revolution's dreams of liberty and equality had given way to fatigue and confusion. What France needed now, he believed, was not another outcry of passion, but order. The firm hand of a leader who could restore what the years of turmoil had scattered. The Directory, sensing its own weakness, had invited him into the heart of power, hoping to use his popularity to save itself. But Napoleon had no interest in being anyone's instrument. As he moved through the city that morning, his expression remained composed, his voice measured, his every gesture deliberate. To those who looked at him, he seemed not like a man seizing power, but one calmly fulfilling an inevitability. By his side walked trusted allies, generals, politicians, and his brother Lucien, who presided over the legislature. Their plan was simple and precise. Under the pretense of a threat to public safety, the legislative councils would be moved out of Paris to the quiet suburb of Saint-Cloud, away from the crowds and the factions that filled the capital. There, surrounded by loyal troops, the government would be reshaped. That morning, As the deputies gathered in Saint-Cloud, confusion spread. The chambers echoed with argument, some demanding explanations, others suspecting betrayal. Outside, soldiers stood in formation, their bayonets glinting in the dim light. Inside, the voices of politicians rose and fell in waves, uncertain of what was happening. Napoleon entered the room wearing his uniform, simple yet immaculate. He spoke not as a conqueror, but as Arman weary of chaos. "Citizens," he said, "the Republic is in danger. The government has lost the confidence of the people. I bring you not tyranny, but peace." His words were calm, almost pleading, but the assembly was not easily soothed. Cries of "dictator" and "treason" filled the air. For a moment, the balance hung uncertain. Then, as shouts turned to chaos, Napoleon's guards entered, clearing the hall. Deputies fled through the doors, and the session dissolved into confusion. Outside, Lucien stood before the soldiers, raising his voice. "Citizens and soldiers," he declared, "my brother is no tyrant. He stands for liberty, for the Republic, for France." In the silence that followed, orders were given and no one resisted. By nightfall, the old directory was gone. A new constitution was drafted, and a new government, the consulate, was formed. 3 consuls would lead it, but from the beginning, everyone knew who truly ruled. Napoleon Bonaparte had taken control, not with blood or battle, but with precision, patience, and the quiet authority of inevitability. In the days that followed, the city settled into calm. These streets were peaceful, the soldiers returned to their barracks, and the people, weary of revolutions and rhetoric, accepted the change with relief. Newspapers spoke of renewal, of stability restored, of the end of confusion. The word coup was not yet in their minds. What they saw instead was a kind of awakening, a sense that France, after so many storms, had at last found its compass. Napoleon spent those first nights of power not in celebration, but in silence. He met with his ministers, reviewed reports, and outlined reforms. His handwriting, neat and deliberate, filled page after page with plans for education, for finance, for rebuilding the army. He worked with the same focus that had once guided him on the battlefield, but now his campaign was one of administration and order. When dawn broke over Paris, the city looked unchanged. The same bridges, the same markets, the same quiet hum of life. But beneath the surface, everything was different. The Republic that had begun with fire and fury a decade earlier had entered a new phase, one of calm, authority, and control. The man who had crossed the Alps and marched across deserts now ruled not by conquest but by confidence. In later years, historians would call the Coup of Brumaire the end of the revolution, but for the people who lived it, it felt more like a sigh of relief. The chaos was over, the shouting had stopped, and France had found a leader who, for better or worse, would give it peace. And so, in a single quiet day, power shifted not through blood or battle, but through stillness, through the presence of a man whose certainty filled the void left by a weary nation. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the restless soldier of the Republic, had become its master. The revolution had consumed kings and generals alike, But at last, it had produced the one figure who could shape its legacy. That night, as the lamps flickered across the Seine and Thessaly settled into its evening calm, Napoleon stood by the window of his home, looking out across the rooftops of Paris. The river flowed steadily beneath the bridges, silent and constant, like time itself. He thought not of the day's triumph, but of what lay ahead, of the France he would build, of the peace he would impose, and of the destiny that even he was beginning to sense would not rest easily. For now, though, all was still. The city slept beneath a quiet sky, and in that stillness, the course of history had quietly changed forever. The winter of 1799 settled gently over Paris, cloaking Thessaly in pale light and silence. For the first time in many years, France was calm. The streets, once filled with crowds shouting of liberty, equality, and vengeance, were now filled instead with the quiet rhythm of ordinary life, merchants at their stalls, carriages in the streets, and families gathered by firesides. The revolution, with all its storms and tumults, seemed to have faded into the distance. In its place stood a new figure, not a king, but not quite a servant of the people either. Napoleon Bonaparte, the young general who had conquered Italy and returned from Egypt like a man from legend, now ruled France as its first consul. His rise had been quick, almost seamless. Where others schemed, he acted. Where others hesitated, he decided. And now, seated at the heart of power, he began the quiet work of rebuilding a country that had nearly destroyed itself. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that revolutions did not end with victory, they ended with stability, and stability required order, law, and faith in something greater than fear. Each day Napoleon rose early. He worked in silence, surrounded by papers and maps, dictating letters, reading reports, issuing decrees. His energy seemed endless, his focus precise. He reorganized the administration, reformed the tax system, and restored efficiency to the army. To his ministers, he was demanding but fair. To the people, distant yet reassuring. France had grown used to men who shouted of freedom. Now it found comfort in a man who simply got things done. He did not seek to erase the revolution, but to contain it. Its ideals of merit, reason, and equality under law would remain, but its violence and unpredictability would not. The revolution is ended, he said, and the Republic is preserved. Under his rule, the guillotine grew silent, the factions dissolved, and the weary nation began to breathe again. One of his earliest and most lasting achievements was the creation of a new legal code, the Code Civil, later known as the Napoleonic Code. It was not a weapon of conquest, but a structure for peace. It set out laws that were clear, uniform, and fair. Laws that respected property, rewarded hard work, and placed all men equal before the courts. It was, in many ways, the revolution transformed into permanence, the chaos of ideals turned into the calm of principle. Napoleon also restored the relationship between France and the Church, which had been torn apart during the years of revolution. He was not a deeply religious man, but he understood the importance of faith as a force of unity. In 1801, he reached an agreement with the Pope, recognizing Catholicism as the faith of most French citizens, while maintaining the state's authority over its clergy. It was a compromise of reason, designed not to inflame, but to heal. Outside of politics, Napoleon's mind was restless with projects. He improved roads and canals, encouraged science and education, and founded new institutions that would outlive him: the Bank of France, the national universities, the Lycée for higher learning. He invited scholars, artists, and mathematicians to his court, seeing in knowledge the same order and discipline that guided his military campaigns. But even as he worked tirelessly to strengthen France, the wares beyond its borders did not cease. Europe, fearful of his ambition, once again formed coalitions against the Republic. The Austrians, the British, and their allies hoped to contain the energy of this new leader before it spread further. Napoleon, calm and deliberate, prepared not for glory, but for necessity. To secure peace, he said quietly, one must be prepared for war. In the spring of 1800, he crossed the Alps once more, not with the desperation of youth, but with the poise of command. The army followed him over icy passes, their footsteps echoing through snow and wind. In paintings, he would later be shown astride a rearing horse, his cloak billowing like a banner. But in truth, he crossed on a mule, cold and silent, guiding his men through hardship with quiet resolve. At Marengo, he met the Austrian army and won one of his most celebrated victories. It was not the ferocity of battle that won the day, but persistence, the kind of steady, unyielding endurance that had carried him from Corsica to command. When he returned to Paris, the city greeted him not as a soldier, but as a statesman. The victory brought peace with Austria and quieted the continent, at least for a time. The people of France, who had endured 10 years of revolution, now saw in Napoleon a figure who seemed to belong to both worlds, the world of the Republic and the world of empire. He spoke of reform, but his presence carried the calm authority of a ruler. In the evenings, he would often work by lamplight, his desk covered with letters from every corner of France. He rarely smiled, rarely rested, but those who served near him said that his intensity was not born of pride, but of purpose. "Power," he once said, "is my instrument, not my goal." Yet those words carried an ambiguity even he may not have fully understood. The more he built, the more indispensable he became. France began to see him not merely as a leader, but as its foundation, the man who had turned chaos into calm. He himself began to sense that his destiny was leading him further than he had once imagined. The revolution had ended, the Republic had stabilized, and yet, in that stillness, something new was forming, an empire waiting to be born, and a crown that, though unspoken, seemed already to cast its shadow over the First Consul's brow. But for now he remained quiet, patient, and steady. The First Consul of France worked late into the night, shaping laws, guiding armies, rebuilding trust. Outside his window, the city of Paris slept, at peace for the first time in years. The lamps along the river flickered softly in the mist, and the Seine moved with its timeless calm, carrying with it the reflection of a nation reborn. By the year 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte had brought France to a rare kind of peace. The wars that had once threatened to consume Europe had quieted for a time. The chaos of revolution was no longer visible in the streets of Paris. Merchants traded freely, families rebuilt their lives, and the rhythm of daily life returned with gentle regularity. France, after years of uncertainty, had found its balance, not through democracy or monarchy, but through the steady hand of one man. He was no longer merely a general, nor simply a politician. He was the First Consul, the architect of a new order, one that valued order, discipline, and progress above all. Under his guidance, France had become efficient, prosperous, and proud. And yet, as the months passed, a question began to linger, whispered first in salons, then in the streets. Could such stability depend forever on one man's name? What would happen if he were gone? Napoleon himself understood this better than anyone. He knew that peace built on personality was fragile, that power without continuity was temporary. The revolution had shown him the danger of instability, governments rising and falling with every change in the wind. If the France he had created was to endure, it needed permanence, something solid that could outlast him. Slowly, the idea took shape, not to restore the old monarchy, but to transform his leadership into something enduring, an empire modern and rational with himself at its center. In May of 1804, the Senate offered him the title of Emperor of the French. It was not the crown of the Bourbons, inherited by birth, but one created by the will of the people, confirmed by a national vote. To Napoleon, this distinction mattered deeply. He did not see himself as aching of old Europe, but as the embodiment of a new age, one where authority came from merit, not ancestry. Still, the ceremony would follow the old forms, for symbols held their own quiet power, and so it was decided that he would be crowned in the great Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, a place steeped in centuries of faith and tradition. Preparations began months in advance. The cathedral was cleaned and illuminated, its stone arches hung with silks, its altars adorned with gold. Outside, the city waited, curious and expectant. On the morning of December 2nd, 1804, the bells of Paris rang out across the winter air. The streets shimmered with frost as carriages rolled toward the cathedral. Inside, the light from thousands of candles flickered against marble and shadow. Dignitaries from across Europe had gathered, their uniforms bright with medals, their faces solemn. The Pope himself, Pius VII, had traveled from Rome to bless the ceremony, a gesture that gave the new empire the aura of divine sanction. At last, Napoleon entered, accompanied by his wife, Josephine. He wore robes of crimson and white, lined with ermine, the weight of history resting quietly upon his shoulders. Josephine, graceful and radiant, followed beside him, her gown shimmering with gold thread. The crowd rose, the music swelled, and all eyes turned toward the altar. The ceremony unfolded with measured grace. The Pope stood ready to perform the ancient ritual, to anoint the emperor and place upon his head the golden crown. But as the moment came, Napoleon stepped forward and gently took the crown in his own hands. He lifted it slowly, deliberately, and placed it upon his own head. The gesture was simple, but its meaning echoed through the ages. He was emperor by his own strength, not by the will of others. And then with equal care he turned and crowned Josephine, the woman who had stood beside him through years of struggle. The act was tender, almost quiet, a personal gesture within a grand ceremony. When it was done, the cathedral filled with the sound of trumpets. "Vive l'Empereur!" rose from the assembly, a cry that spread beyond the walls, through the streets, across the city. Outside, the crowds echoed it, their voices rising into the cold December air. For many it was not the return of monarchy, but the arrival of something new, their birth of French greatness, embodied in a single man. Yet beneath the splendor, there was stillness. The candles flickered in the vast space of Notre Dame, their light soft and golden. The Pope lowered his head. Napoleon stood quietly, his expression unreadable. He had reached the height of worldly ambition, yet his eyes seemed distant, as though he saw beyond the glory to the weight that came with it. That evening, Paris glowed with celebration. Fireworks lit the sky, the Seine shimmered with reflections, and the sound of bells carried across the rooftops. But in the Tuileries Palace, Napoleon worked late into the night, signing decrees, reviewing reports, his desk lit by a single lamp. For him, the coronation was not an end, but a beginning. The formal seal on what he already believed his destiny to be. The world had watched a soldier crown himself emperor, and in doing so, had witnessed a moment unlike any other. It was the union of revolution and tradition, of reason and grandeur, of ambition and duty. And though the empire he created would one day fade, the image of that quiet moment, the young general lifting the crown in his own hands, would endure long after the echoes of trumpets had died away. France, for now, was content. Its long years of chaos had given way to order, its uncertainty to confidence. And at its heart stood Napoleon, the man who had risen from obscurity to the throne of emperors, whose story had carried him from a small island in the Mediterranean to the heights of human ambition. The revolution had once promised that any man might rise by merit. In him, that promise had reached its fullest and perhaps its most complicated form. By the time the crown rested upon his head, Napoleon Bonaparte had come farther than any man of his age could have imagined. From the windswept island of Corsica to the marble halls of Paris, his journey had been one of movement. Forward, always forward. He had conquered armies, reshaped nations, and bent the currents of history to his will. Yet power, even when absolute, is never still. It breathes, it shifts, and it asks apris of those who hold it. In the years that followed his coronation, Napoleon stood at the center of Europe. Kings and emperors who had once dismissed him now watched him with wary respect. His armies stretched across borders, his laws reached beyond France, His influence extended into every corner of the continent. The peace he had promised was real for a time, but it was a peace maintained by vigilance, by structure, and by his own unyielding presence. He worked tirelessly, sleeping little, his mind constantly engaged. Ministers came and went at all hours. Reports arrived from every province, every army, every newly governed land. He read each one carefully, marking notes in the margins, asking questions no one else thought tosque. To those who served him, he seemed unstoppable, a man of steel and calculation, yet capable of remarkable calm. He rarely raised his voice, and when he did, it wasn't anger but command, quiet and complete. And yet, even in his greatest moments, there were silences, the silences of reflection, of solitude, of a man who knew that glory was both luminous and fleeting. Sometimes, late at night, he would walk the long corridors of his palace alone. The lamps flickered softly against the gilded walls, the sound of his boots echoing faintly on the polished floors. He would pause before a window and look out over Paris, the city that had crowned him, the city that had once cried for freedom and now slept under his rule. He had given France order, prosperity, and pride. He had ended the revolution's endless uncertainty, replacing it with the certainty of one man's vision. But in doing so, he'd also placed upon himself a burden that no other could share. He had turned chaos into calm, but that calm depended entirely upon his presence. Power, he once said, is a fleeting thing. It can be taken by abilette, a betrayal, or simply by time. And yet, it is not power itself that defines a life, but what is built with it. In that sense, Napoleon's empire was more than conquest. It was the expression of his mind, the laws, the roads, the schools, the institutions that would long outlive him. Even those who would later oppose him could not entirely escape what he had made. For France, he was both savior and shadow, the one who'd restored order and the one who had quietly replaced freedom with control. But perhaps he understood that the two were not easily separated. He believed that liberty without stability was fragile, that nations needed guidance before they could truly govern themselves. Whether he was right or wrong, history would debate for centuries, but in his heart, he saw his rule as continuation, not betrayal, of the revolution's ideals. In the quiet of his later reflections, one can imagine Napoleon thinking of those who had come before him, of Caesar, of Charlemagne, of Alexander. He had studied their lives as a young man, tracing their victories and their downfalls. Now, he had joined their ranks, not in name, beauty, and legacy. Yet where their stories had ended in conquest, his was also a story of governance, of the art of shaping nations rather than merely defeating them. He knew, as all great figures do, that time would one day turn against him. Fortune, that silent companion of ambition, never remains loyal forever. Wars would return, alliances would break, and even the greatest empire could be unmade by the same forces that created it: human pride, uncertainty, and the restless turning of history's wheel. But for this moment, this fleeting golden moment, the world was his. The map of Europe bent around his vision. France stood proud, her people prosperous, her institutions strong. The child of Corsica had become the ruler of the continent. And yet, perhaps even then, he sensed the fragility of it all, how easily triumph could become solitude, and how quickly destiny could turn from gift to weight. Still, there was calm in that knowledge. He had lived not as a man of hesitation, but of motion. Every step he had taken had carried him forward, through the smoke of battle, through the halls of government, through the endless complexities of power. He had believed, above all, in will, the force that shapes men, nations, and the course of time itself. When we look back now, what remains of Napoleon is not only the wars or the crowns, but the image of the mind behind them, restless, precise, and determined. The laws he wrote, the systems he built, the roads he laid, still trace their way across Europe, silent reminders of a man who refused to accept disorder. And so, the story of his rise is not merely one of conquest, but of transformation, of a world remade by one man's vision and the cost that such vision demands. For in every triumph lies its shadow, and in every act of creation, the quiet echo of its undoing. As night deepened over Paris, and the city lay still beneath its pale lights, Napoleon Bonaparte stood once more at the window, his reflection merging with the darkness beyond. The river flowed quietly below, as it had before him, and as it would long after. He watched it for a while, the steady, eternal movement of water, calm and certain. And perhaps he smiled faintly, knowing that everything he had built would one day pass, but that his name, history, and his shadow would remain. And so ends the story of his rise, not with the roar of battle, but with silence. The silence of a man who had climbed as high as one can climb, who had seen both the light of power and the shadow it casts. The boy from Thailand, the soldier of the revolution, the First Consul, the emperor, all one and the same. His life was a journey toward greatness, but also a meditation on what greatness truly means. And as the quiet hours of night folded around him, one could almost imagine the faintest whisper, soft and timeless, that history, like the river, moves always forward, carrying with it the memory of those who shaped its course, and the calm understanding that nothing, not even empire, lasts forever.